Welcome back to Learn the TCG. Today we're going to be talking about how to plan out a turn. In the past, I've talked about sequencing and prize mapping, and this is where it all gets put together. For every turn, we're going to want to have some sort of goal that we're trying to achieve, and for the majority of the game, that's going to be decided by our prize map. And then our goal or our plan for the turn is going to decide what cards we're looking for, and that is going to be what dictates what the correct sequencing would be. What phase of the game it is generally going to change what our goal for the turn should be as well. And we're just breaking the game up into three phases: early, mid, and late game. The early game is pretty simple. For a vast majority of decks right now, we're just worried about getting basic Pokemon into play, and each deck is going to have Pokemon that are of higher or lower priority to find early in the game. Like, if we can get 5 basic Pokemon down, we can really grab whatever we want, but the times that we can only get down a couple of basics is when we're going to want to know which of those Pokemon have a higher priority, and these are usually going to be things like evolving basics, or it could even be matchup dependent. Like, if we're playing Raging Bolt, we might want to go out of our way to get the baby Raging Bolt first instead of the Raging Bolt EX. Either way though, that is a nice thing to be aware of whenever playing a deck. The mid game is the turns between the early and late game. This is generally when both players are set up, and this is also when we're going to want to do our prize mapping, because it's pretty hard to figure out what we want to knock out in the early game because we don't know what our opponent is going to get out and what they're going to have evolved and everything. But by the mid game, we can generally have an idea of what is going to be in play for the game. So this one, we're going to want to start thinking about that. But for the most part, we're just trying to figure out what attack we want to use and what we want to hit into, and trying to get the cards to do that, as well as making sure that we can maintain our setup. And I think of the start of the late game as the turn that I'm going to be going down to 3 or less prizes remaining. For these last couple of turns, we're really going to want to figure out what our last 1 or 2 attacks are going to be and what attackers we need to set up. But we're also trying to prepare for hand disruption at this point. And this is usually done by just thinning out our deck as much as we can, as well as trying to get as strong of a board state as possible. This is also usually when I'll try to go out of my way to preemptively bench something like Mew EX or Pheasantipity. At this point of the game, we're just trying to get our board state as strong as possible so that no matter what our opponent does, we have some way to respond. To figure out our plan for the turn, we're going to need to answer a few questions, and this might seem like a lot, but during a game, it's mostly intuitive, and it's not like, we have to pull out a checklist and literally ask these questions every time. The first place to start would be, what is my overall plan to win this game? And that's mostly just going to be, am I prize racing my opponent, or am I planning for some kind of comeback? And this is going to kind of help to simplify things, because if the answer is just, I am prize racing my opponent, then we can just knock out whatever is the easiest 2-prizer to KO. We don't really have to think too much further into it. And this is also something that is going to be pretty apparent earlier on in the game. Most decks are always going to have 2-prize Pokemon in play, so if one player takes the first 2 prizes, they are just ahead in the prize trade at that point. So if we're the player that is behind in prizes, we are going to be relying on our opponent missing something at some point, even if that is just we need them to not have boss every single turn of the game. We're still relying on them to miss something. And the next thing I like to do is think about what I think the best possible turn I could have would look like, and what is the bare minimum that I need to accomplish this turn. I find that thinking about what the bare minimum that I need to do for a turn really helps to give some clarity and simplifies what I realistically need to do. Like, instead of thinking, well, I need to find my attacker and an energy and a boss's order, it becomes, well, I'm ahead in the prize trade, I just need to take 2 prizes. What is the simplest, easiest way to do that? Or if we are behind in the prize trade, in those situations, we're going to need to prioritize trying to disrupt our opponent a little bit more, or being a little bit more thoughtful about which Pokemon we knock out in particular. And the amount of risk that we're going to take for any given turn is going to directly correlate with how far behind or how far ahead we are. The further behind we are, the more risk we need to take, and the further ahead we are is generally going to mean that we can just play it a bit safer and focus on our own side of the board a bit more. And I find that really considering what the best turn looks like and what the bare minimum looks like helps with tunnel vision for me quite a bit. Tunnel vision is, of course, just focusing so hard on one play that it's hard to see anything outside of that. And I've definitely had some problems with tunnel vision, so I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about how to remedy it. While it's definitely not the simplest thing to fix, and a lot of the times that it happens, we're not actually aware that it's happening in the moment. But I do think that taking a second to consider a full range of plays has definitely helped for me. And now that we know what we're actually trying to accomplish for the turn, we can go back and ask, do I really need to go all out for this best possible turn? Or does a more conservative play or even the bare minimum accomplish the same thing while saving resources that are going to be more useful at a later turn? And just because a play is saving resources doesn't always necessarily mean that it's the right play. And that's why we're asking ourselves, are these resources actually going to be more useful later? Sometimes they're not going to be more useful. We don't think that we'll need those cards later, so we might as well play them now, because that is essentially thinning our deck. One way to thin cards out is just by playing them. So playing more cards doesn't always mean that it is a worse play. And after answering all those questions, we should know what we want to do for the turn. Now we just have to figure out what cards do we need to find and which of those cards are the most important. And if the answer is, we already have all the cards in our hand, perfect. We just do the play that we want to do, and that's simple enough. But most of the time we are going to have to find at least one other card. But when it's multiple cards, knowing which cards are the most important is going to help decide what our sequencing is going to be. Like if we need to find rare candy, a Pokemon, and a boss's orders, we're going to prioritize the rare candy and the Pokemon typically, because if we just find the boss, that doesn't really matter because we're not going to be able to attack at that point anyway. And then this would be the point where we use all of our draw abilities or player draw support or whatever for the turn. And once we have drawn all the cards, we can go back and ask, did I get what I need? If yes, that's pretty easy. We just play the cards and do whatever we're trying to do. It's when we do not find what we're looking for that is quite a bit harder. And we have to start going with what could I possibly do instead of what do I want to do. And we have to figure out if it's actually even worth doing. Like if we whiff the attacker that we want to use, but we can use some other subpar attacker, it is worth asking, is that attack even worth using? And the way to figure that out is, does this attack decrease the number of attacks that I need to win from here? Or will it make my other turns easier? And if the answer to both of those is no, maybe it's just not worth using this subpar attack. And these are going to end up being the turns in the middle of the game where we end up using like Badoo or Cleffa, or even just retreating to a one prize Pokemon and passing. And then we have to ask, how do I win from here? And is it worth it to try to make my opponent's next turn as hard as possible? Like, is the way that I win from here, my opponent only takes a single prize this turn, then we would just retreat into a one prizer and hope that they can't get boss? Or do I need them to just not be able to attack at all this turn? Then maybe we would try to counter catcher or boss something up to force them to have a way to retreat it. Hopefully these situations are few and far between, but they are kind of inevitably going to happen at least every once in a while. Say for example, we are playing Roaring Moon and the board state looks like this. We're ahead in the prize trade, so we would start with, what is our plan to win this game? And that is pretty simply just going to be try to prize raise our opponent. And then next we would ask, what is the best possible turn look like versus what is the bare minimum that I need to accomplish? The bare minimum is going to be just knock out the 2 prize Pokemon in the active spot. And in this case, the best turn would just be to knock out our opponent's Gardevoir EX and try to force them to have to find another Gardevoir. Now, what are we actually trying to accomplish this turn? Well, we're just trying to take 2 prize cards, so is it really necessary to knock out our opponent's Gardevoir? Sure, that might make it a little bit more difficult for them in the future, but that is going to burn some of our gusting resources, and since we are up against a deck that is going to attack with 1 prize Pokemon at some point, we are almost definitely going to have to use a gust effect on our next turn, so is it really necessary to boss up our opponent's Gardevoir and knock it out? And in this situation, I think the answer to that is no. They already have another Curly on the bench. It's going to be pretty simple for them to get out another Gardevoir, and we're never going to make it so that they can't ever have a Gardevoir out, because if we boss up the Guardy this turn and knock it out, they get out a new one, and we boss it up and knock out the next one. We just win the game at that point. So would we be better off to save our boss's orders for the next turn? And for the purpose of the example, we're going to say yes. We're just trying to take 4 prizes in 2 attacks, and boss's orders, or even maybe Pokemon Catcher, is going to be one of our most valuable resources for next turn. And our opponent is almost definitely going to Iono us this next turn to 2. So the more copies of boss that we have in our deck, the more likely we are to draw one, and therefore the more likely we are to win the game. And I think aggressive decks like this are most often when I see people kind of overcomplicate things and worry a little bit too much about annoying their opponent, when going for a more straightforward and simple plan on our own side of the board is most likely more often going to lead to a win. Now, that's not to say we should always kind of play like a more solitaire game and not worry about what our opponent is going to do, but there is a balance of it. And I think more generally speaking, the further behind we are in a game, the more we should be worried about trying to disrupt our opponent. And the further ahead we are in the game, the more we should just be focused on making our own board as strong as possible and trying to make sure that we can always do what we want. And how much we let what our opponent is going to want to do on their own turn impact our own plays is going to depend a bit on what deck we're actually playing. Like the example I used earlier with Roaring Moon, or a deck like Goldango generally isn't very concerned with what the opponent is actually going to do on their turn. We're more just worried about getting our own game plan off, because our game plan is strong enough to where we should end up winning the games a lot of the time as long as we can actually accomplish it. But a deck like Gardevoir or Dragapult, we're going to want to use what our opponent plans to do for their turn as kind of a filter when we're making our own decisions on what we're going to do for our turn. And decks like that are generally able to think that way a little bit better too, because they have a little bit more control over where they put their damage and aren't forced to put all the damage on one single Pokemon to take a knockout every turn. So with those decks, we can do things like choosing to only take a single prize on a turn so that our opponent doesn't have access to Counter Catcher on their next turn, or even just choosing to not take a knockout at all so our opponent doesn't get to draw with Pheasantipity, things like that. Now I'm going to go over a game that I played, and hopefully this is going to help the rest of this video kind of come together and make sense, because a lot of these thoughts are kind of weird to explain, and as with most things in Pokemon, every single situation has like 3 different exceptions. And this is a game from the previous format, but the game itself isn't super important. It's more just about the thought process behind the decisions. So it is Gardevoir vs Flareon, which, the way this format is shaping up, is still going to be a relevant matchup. And as with most setup decks, the early game is pretty straightforward, and we know that our goal is just to get a couple of Ralts into play, and maybe even retreat to a Baduda item lock or a Cleffa to draw. The only real decision here with this hand would be whether to play Research or Iono. And normally with an opponent having like a lower hand size like this, Research is just a better decision, but in this case they played Fan Rotom. We know they have access to Noctowl in their hand, so Iono seems more appealing just based off of that alone. And in this matchup specifically, we know there's a chance that our Gardevoir EXs end up getting shuffled back into the deck, so getting rid of Rare Candy is just a little bit worse. So there are pros and cons to each. I end up choosing Iono in this situation, and we end up drawing into a pretty subpar hand. And keeping the goal in mind of just trying to find Ralts, this hand that we got off Iono basically plays itself. We have to play it in a way that we just play the most amount of cards possible out of it. And that is, of course, bench all the Pokemon, attach the Bravery Charm, vessel away the energy, and then draw 3 with Mew. And once again, the results of that just kind of play themselves out. Just get a Ralts, retreat to Cleffa, and draw some cards. Now this next hand is a little bit trickier, and I do think that I end up playing this turn out wrong, but this is the point where I start thinking, what does the best possible turn look like? What is the bare minimum I need to do? The best possible turn is probably Rare Candy up into a Gardevoir, Counter Catcher the UEX or Pheasantipity, and knock it out with Drifloon. What is the bare minimum? Get another Ralts down and evolve into Kirlia. The only tricky part with this is we're basically committing to one play or the other out of just this hand alone before seeing what we draw off of the Research. And I think I probably should have just Ultra Balled for a Ralts, evolved to Kirlia Research, set up for a better play next turn, because there's only one Counter Catcher in the deck. So even if I do get Candy Guardy and no counter catcher, I am not going to knock out this Fan Rotom. That just makes no sense. It's giving them free draw with Pheasantipity and not really making my board state any better. Not to mention the fact that they didn't do very much with their previous hand, so I definitely don't want to give them card draw for no real impact in the prize trade. So I should have just Ultra Ball for Ultra Ball to Kirlia research, but I do end up going all out for the Candy Guardy play. This is definitely one of those spots where the decisions are much more clear watching the game than they were for some reason playing the game. And that is definitely something I've been trying to work on myself, is to be able to think about the game when I'm actually playing it the same way that I would when I'm watching the game. It's really hard to do, and it's not always objectively correct, but I do think that for me, my thought processes are much more clear when I'm watching a game than they are when I'm in a game. So this hand is a little bit awkward, did get punished by not even getting the Kirlia, but by having an energy on the Clefairy, we do have a pretty clear line of play for next turn. We're going to be able to hopefully knock out whatever's in the active spot because our opponent did fill the bench. And now is the part where we missed the play that we were going for. What do we do now? What do we need to win the game? And the answer probably is do not let our opponent take 2 prizes by any means. And even retreating to this Drifloon seems pretty good because it's going to make it so that our opponent doesn't just get a free prize with their Fan Rotom. So we're forcing them to need a little bit more, like if they play Jamming Tower, or at least a way to attack with Flareon. And they do end up getting the Flareon knockout. And this again comes back to what is the best possible turn and what is the bare minimum I need to do. And I think this is one of the rare situations where both of them kind of line up. The bare minimum I need to do just comes down to take 2 prizes. And the easiest way to take 2 prizes here is to counter catcher up the EVEX, which also I do believe is the best possible play, because if our opponent can evolve that up into a Sylveon next turn and use the Angelite attack, we're going to be in a pretty tough spot. So both plays line up. We already have the play in hand. There's not too much to think about. I just need to attach basic energy to the Clefairy and counter catcher up the Eevee and knock it out. The only other decision is, do I Iono? Do I research? Do I play the secret box? But at this point in the game, I think keeping the hand the way that it is pretty good. I have basically unlimited options with the secret box in hand for next turn. I could secret box for an Ultra Ball for my Gardevoir and Artisan to get whatever other attacker that I want. And the game is in a spot where if they do get an Angelite off next turn and shuffle my Ralts and Kirlia into the deck, I can just attack with my Clefairy and knock it out and hopefully get a couple more Ralts into play and still be in a pretty good spot to win the game. So I do decide to just not play the secret box or any supporter and knock out the Ralts. And of course, this is a Flareon build that plays Unfair Stamp, so they Unfair Stamp me to 2. And when I was playing the game, this kind of sucked, but for the purposes of explaining this, I think it worked out best this way, because with such a limited hand size, to me, it doesn't really make sense to start off with thinking like, what is the best possible play I can do? It's more like, what can I possibly do with this hand? And the answer to that is try to play as many cards out of it as possible and draw as much with Mew as I can to hopefully get into some real options. And then of course I do end up top decking an energy, which isn't really ideal because now we can't play all 3 cards out of the hand, but attaching the dark I think is the only real option. And then Stretcher for Drifloon seems good because I do need to attack with a 1 prize Pokemon this turn to have the best chances of winning the game. We're able to draw 2 with Mew, draw into a Nest Ball. Nest Ball for Pheasantipity is still the only option at this point, and we do end up getting kind of rewarded for saving the secret box and drawing into it. And this is where the sequencing portion of all this comes into play. What do I need to do with this secret box? Well, I need to get an Iono, I need to get a Bravery Charm, and I need to have enough cards left over in my hand to Ultra Ball for my Gardevoir EX. So that means that I am forced to secret box away the 2 energy and the Nest Ball, which I guess is not really forced to. Those are pretty good targets for it. And then I have to get my Iono, my Bravery Charm, and a Stadium and another item card to discard with the Ultra Ball. And I don't really think that I choose the best item to discard. I do grab the last Ultra Ball out of the deck, which I do think a rare candy would have been a better grab, but this is one of those times where in the moment I'm not thinking completely clearly, and for some reason I'm thinking that I need both of those rare candies in case they attack with Sylveon or whatever, but it is not possible for them to attack with Sylveon next turn because we know they play on Fair Stamp, and I am once again playing around plays that are not possible for my opponent to achieve. But anyway, I did grab the Ultra Ball, so now this hand once again plays itself. Ultra Ball away, Ultra Ball in Stadium, attach the Bravery Charm, and play the Iono. And we do get a little lucky by drawing into a Stadium here. Now we can play down the Stadium and force my opponent to either get rid of one of their Noctowls or either their Mew or Pheasantipity. And of course at this point they're not going to get rid of Fez because they don't know what the plan is for the turn. Of course they expect the Flareon to be knocked out. This is another spot where I don't know if I make the exact correct play, but Gardevoir is one of those decks that has the upside of being able to manipulate the board state and not be forced to take a knockout every turn. We can like clean up knockouts with Monkey Dory. So my choice here is between putting 5 energy on Drifloon and knocking out Flareon, giving my opponent access to Pheasantipity to draw cards, or hitting into the Flareon for 240 and planning to take a 4 prize turn next turn with the Monkey Dory damage, as well as counter catcher or boss of the Mew EX or the Pheasantipity. Like I said, I don't know if I made the best choice here, but I do decide to just hit into the Flareon for 240 because they can't attack next turn. So I'm forcing them to find a lot off of just the 3 cards that they got off of the Iono, which if they draw into Ultra Ball, they just need to get Switch and Boss's orders. But I think at the time I was more worried about a Blood Moon Ursaluna play, but Flareon does not play Blood Moon typically, so I probably shouldn't have played around that. I think had I knocked out the Flareon, there really is no good way that they could take their last 2 prize cards. They would need like Terapagos, Trumpet, Energy, and a way to fill up their bench to at least 6 Pokemon and a boss's order. Another thing that I should have considered was I can't draw any cards next turn, so there's really like no guarantee that I'm going to be able to find either counter catcher or boss. But I do think that still illustrates the kind of thought process pretty well, and my opponent does end up playing an Iono, which does help us out quite a bit, and the fact that we're at 4 prizes here still does end up being pretty nice. And then now we start our turn with 3 researches in hand as well as an Iono, and then once again the decisions here: what does the best possible play look like and what is the bare minimum I need to do? And of course the best play is win the game, and the bare minimum also is probably either win the game or Iono my opponent, and I don't think Iono is a very good option because I need to knock out this Flareon, so I'm giving them access to Pheasantipity either way. And this is also a situation where it's good to remember what was put to the bottom of the deck the previous turn with Iono. I know the bottom 3 cards of my deck are not counter catcher, and I can research here and draw with Fez and leave it so that my deck is only 2 cards, which of course is guaranteeing that I get into the counter catcher. So thinning the deck with Artisan here would actually not be thinning, it would just make it so that there is a chance that we don't end up getting the counter catcher and inevitably probably end up losing the game because my opponent would just need an energy, and we know they have boss in hand, so they could boss up Pheasantipity, attach an energy, and then snipe my Ralts off the bench for the final prize. Hopefully that helped to give some context to what I was trying to explain earlier. I have tried to film this video at least 10 times and just haven't liked how it's come out, so I decided just to go for it. There's been times in the past where I thought the videos came out terribly and people seem to like them, so I'm just going to go with it and put it out. Hopefully this helps at least one person with, decision making and planning out turns, but if not, maybe I can do a better job at it in the future. And I want to give a thanks to Gugo6031. Thank you for the donation. And as always, a huge shout out to the channel members. I do greatly appreciate it. And if you like this video, I do have a whole playlist of the Learn the TCG series. And I think that this really goes well with the prize trade and prize mapping video as well as the sequencing video. I do think it's kind of like the video that ties it all together. So check those out and like or dislike, comment and subscribe. Take care and have a good one.